talks about the need to endure hardship for the sake of the gospel. And this idea of enduring hardship for the gospel calls to mind something that St. Augustine wrote about once, which is two things that he said every Christian is called to do. And the first is to do good, and that makes sense to us. As Christians, we're called to do good. But the second thing St. Augustine identified is to endure evil. Every Christian is called to both do good and also to endure evil. And we hear about doing good a lot, and that makes sense, but we don't always hear about or think about this need for us as Christians to endure evil. And there's a few different ways to approach this. There's a few different kinds of evil that we're called to endure. The obvious one is moral evil. When we think of evil, we think of sin, and that's a moral evil. And we're not really called to endure evil or sin within ourselves. We're called to stamp that out and to repent from that kind of evil. But there is a sense in which we're called to endure evil in the sense of other people's sins. This doesn't mean we condone their sins or support their sins or approve of them in any way, but we endure the effects of their sin. And this is necessary for forgiveness. If we are to forgive other people as Christ calls us to do, we have to endure the evil that their sin does in our life. To forgive someone isn't to say, your sin has not hurt me, but to forgive someone is to say, your sin has hurt me, and I will endure that pain, I will endure that suffering because I love you, for the sake of our relationship. That's what it means to forgive. And so we absolutely have to endure the sin and the imperfections that we all have, the ways that we inflict evil on each other in order to live a Christian life in this world. So that's one way that we're called to endure evil. We're also called to endure physical evils. And by physical evils, I mean those bad things that happen that no one's really responsible for. Things like disease or illness or injury or accidents or natural disasters. Bad things just happen in the world and it's nobody's fault. And we're called to endure these things. And this is a reminder to us that we live in a fallen world. When Adam fell, the world fell with him. God put Adam at the head of creation. And so when he committed that first sin, that original sin, all of creation fell with him. And just as we are now subject to death and decay because of sin, the world around us is subject to death as well. We live in a dying world. The good news is that just as we have hope in the resurrection and we hope to receive glorified bodies in heaven, the world will be resurrected as well. In Revelation, the scriptures speak of a new heaven and a new earth to be created by God. But we don't live in that world yet. We don't live in that new glorified world. We still live in this fallen world that is dying, and so we have to endure the evils of living in this fallen world. And then there's a third way that we're called to endure evil, and that is the suffering and the hardships that we endure as Christian disciples that we perceive as evil. Disciple comes from the same word as discipline. And St. Paul talks about this in his second letter to Timothy as well, that spirit of self-control that God gives us as Christians. For most of us, self-control doesn't come easily. We have to work at it, and it involves hardship and suffering. College students know this. If you're pursuing a major, if you're trying to earn a degree, that requires discipline. You have to discipline yourself to achieve that goal, and that involves hardship. When parents discipline their children, they are, in a sense, inflicting suffering on their children, but they're doing it out of love because they want their children to be better. We endure all kinds of self-inflicted suffering if we have a goal that we're trying to achieve, if we're starting an exercise regimen, if we're starting a weight loss plan, if we're trying to learn a new skill, anything like that. We know that we have to discipline ourselves in order to achieve that goal, and that involves hardship. We perceive those things as evil because we don't like suffering, but there is a greater good that we're trying to achieve. And this is, the ultimate secret to suffering that Jesus shows us from the cross, and that is that not all suffering is evil, that suffering can be redemptive, especially if it brings about this good. And if we're willing to endure the suffering and the hardship that discipline demands of us for the sake of a better body, or for the sake of a college degree or something that we're striving for, how much more should we gladly endure this suffering for the sake of Christ, for the sake of the gospel? Because after all, that's what love is. Love is being willing to endure suffering for the sake of another. And this is the kind of love that Christ shows us on the cross. This is the kind of love that we're called to offer him in return. Praise be Jesus Christ.